It began with a sound. Not a scream, not a whisper, but something in between, something that pressed against the inside of your skull as you tried to sleep, something that felt like a thought not your own. In the spring of 1840, the town of Whisperfield, Nebraska was quiet in every way a place could be quiet. Crops were slow, rivers still, and not one child had been born that year. But then came the man with no voice, and everything that followed was noise. His name was Elias Stroud. He arrived without a horse, carrying no luggage. He walked into Whisperfield from the North Road on April 17th, wearing a long grey coat and boots thick with red dust. No one saw him speak. Not to the stationman, not to the tavern boy, not even to Reverend Alden Pike when asked directly, "What brings you west of the river, friend?" Elias merely turned his head, and somehow the Reverend understood, not because of any gesture or facial expression, but because a single phrase entered his mind like a memory, "I'm here for what was left unfinished." That was the first incident. The next happened the same night. Clara Wren, the widow who lived by the livery, reported waking at precisely 3:12 a.m. to a voice inside her bedroom. Not through the door or wall, inside the room, clear as glass. "Tell the sheriff what you buried behind the shed." She did, and the sheriff did dig, and what they found wrapped in oilcloth and pine roots was indeed a pistol, the same pistol used to kill her late husband 3 years prior. A cold case reopened, not by evidence, but by words no one spoke. Elias Stroud had not left the tavern that night. In fact, he had not moved from his cot, as testified by the tavern boy who slept in the adjacent hall. But 7 other residents, all upstanding, all unrelated, reported hearing that same voice before dawn. Some claimed they felt breath on their neck. Others awoke to the sound of their own names being whispered from just behind the curtain. All swore the voice was male. All agreed it was Elias's, though none had ever heard him speak aloud. Dr. Miriam Cross, the town's only physician and one-time spiritual skeptic, was the first to confront him. She arrived at the tavern midday on April 19th, a storm brewing behind her. When she entered Elias's room, she found him seated in the corner with his coat still on, eyes shut, palms resting flat on his knees. She asked 3 questions. His eyes never opened, but she left pale and shaken, refusing to recount what she'd heard. Only weeks later, in her journal, would she scribble a single sentence. The voice described a thing from my 2nd year of schooling, a thing no one alive could know, a thing I had buried behind St. Elias Chapel in Massachusetts. Elias remained in Whisperfield. He did not preach. He did not beg. He simply walked the perimeter of town each morning, pausing often, sometimes staring into homes, sometimes into trees. Where he looked, secrets surfaced. By the end of that week, 2 affairs had been confessed. A long missing girl's remains were discovered beneath the black stone orchard, and the church organist surrendered himself for an arson committed in 1836. He still never spoke. It was as though Elias Stroud had been sent not to teach, but to remind that memory is not safe, and silence is not mercy. People began to bar their windows, not from fear of what he'd do, but from fear of what they might hear while dreaming. And then, on the 8th night, Reverend Pike heard something that shook him so completely, he vanished before sunrise. "She's still alive. Under the altar," the voice had told him. "You know the one I mean." The following morning, the church doors stood ajar. Reverend Alden Pike's personal effects were gone, his pulpit empty, his ledger missing. What remained was a note written on the back of a hymn sheet, found nailed to the chapel's eastern wall. It contained just 2 lines. "Forgive me, I never thought she would survive." Word spread quickly. By midday, a gathering of townsfolk stood staring at the stone floor beneath the altar of St. Mercia's Chapel, whispering, debating, dreading. Sheriff Halston, though a religious man, refused to act without physical proof. But that evening, as the sun dropped behind the cottonwoods, a shrill sound pierced the quiet. Not a cry, not a word, but the unmistakable sound of nails against stone. That night, the altar was moved. Beneath it, packed in the narrow crawl space where coal had once been stored, lay a girl of no more than 9. Filthy, weak, but very much alive. Her wrists bore faint marks of restraints. Her clothes were nothing more than scraps, and though her mouth moved, her voice had gone. She was not a stranger. Her name was Clara Pike, daughter of the Reverend's late sister, assumed to have died in a river accident 2 years prior. The family funeral had been closed. Casket, the cause of death, accepted as drowning, and yet here she was, breathing, eyes darting from face to face, as if searching for someone who wasn't there. By morning, the townspeople no longer whispered about Elias Stroud. They watched him, some with fear, some with reverence, most with both. Dr. Miriam Cross took charge of the girl's recovery. In her clinical notes, she made a troubling observation. Though Clara had no visible head trauma, she displayed aphasia, a loss of language unrelated to vocal injury. When presented with simple objects, she could not name them. When shown her own reflection, she did not respond, and when Elias Stroud entered the infirmary for the first time since her rescue, she collapsed into seizures so violent it took 3 men to restrain her. Still, Elias never approached her again. By the 2nd week of May, Whisperfield had changed. No crimes had occurred, no arrests were made, but confessions multiplied. Old Mrs. Yates wept at the schoolhouse, admitting she'd burned her sister's will. Jonah Welch brought a bloody hammer to the constable, saying it had spoken to him in his dreams, and the blacksmith's apprentice was found sobbing on his forge floor, repeating the same phrase over and over. "I didn't mean to. I thought he'd stop breathing." Some said it was mass hysteria, others said it was prophecy. But what no one could ignore was that Elias Stroud had never once opened his mouth, and yet every person who encountered him seemed to hear something. Not outside, but within. Children feared the shadow he cast. Men drank themselves numb before sundown. The town's bell stopped ringing. Its rope had frayed without warning, snapping in the belfry like a severed nerve. On the 15th day of his stay, Elias did something new. He wrote a single sentence scratched into the tavern's floorboard with the edge of a spoon. "You do not understand what you buried, only why." That night, 3 graves were unearthed. 2 were empty. The 3rd did not match any known name in the town's registry. Miriam Cross was called to inspect the remains. What she uncovered would later be described in her final journal entry, an entry no one else ever read. It was burned by her assistant the next morning under orders she had given just before dawn. She died that same day. Witnesses say her final words were not her own, but spoken in a voice far deeper than hers, as if borrowed. He was not sent to judge, he was sent to remember. After Dr. Miriam Cross died, something shifted in Whisperfield, the kind of shift that can't be named, only felt. Doors creaked open when no wind blew. Clocks stopped just before the hour. Cattle refused to pass the north edge of town. The tavern boy, once cheery and brash, no longer spoke to guests, just stared out the window, pale and glass-eyed, as if listening to something only he could hear. By the 17th day, no child in Whisperfield had spoken a word, not in play, not in protest. At first, parents blamed fear, then infection. But the town doctor, recently returned from Lincoln, found no signs of illness, no inflammation, no fever, just silence. Absolute, obedient silence. Elias Stroud had not left his room for 2 nights. The tavern owner, Mr. Darrow, described the air around his door as thick as pond water. Matches wouldn't light in that hallway. One traveler who passed the room at dusk claimed the candle in his hand, extinguished without wind, and when he turned to relight it, the door was gone. Not closed, but gone. The hallway replaced by wall. By the 18th day, the bells returned. Not from the belfry, but from below. The sound was faint at first, metallic and distant, like the ringing of old iron deep in the ground. It came at dusk and faded by moonrise. No one knew where it came from, but it always stopped the moment Elias stepped outside. When asked where he went during those long walks, which direction he took, how far, no one could say. He would leave by one path and be seen hours later returning from another. Mud never clung to his boots. His coat, though thick and woolen, never showed signs of wear. Mrs. Crowley swore she saw him walk across the frozen pond behind the grist mill, even though the ice had long since melted. She claimed he didn't walk on the surface, but slightly above it, by no more than an inch. On the 19th night, 3 families left town, packed their wagons without a word, and rode east before sunrise. One of them, the Wilkinses, left their dog behind, a shepherd mutt named Danner, who had never once barked at a person. That morning, it was found at the chapel steps, teeth bared, eyes wide with fear, howling not at Elias, but at his shadow. The town council met the next day. Sheriff Halston, though visibly unnerved, proposed escorting Elias to the county line, citing public distress. But as the motion was raised, each man heard something behind his ear, not loud, not sharp, just a whisper, "You buried her too." That was all it took. Not a vote, not a shout, just silence. Thick and guilty. Because it was true. 16 years earlier, a girl had gone missing during the winter flood. Her name was Eliza Hemmings. She was 11. Last seen near the schoolhouse steps after dismissal. Her mother searched every field, every barn, every church. Sheriff Halston, then a deputy, had helped drag the creek twice. Nothing was found. No body, no clothing, not even a ribbon. But she'd never left town. 2 hours after the council dissolved, Halston rode to the schoolhouse alone. He brought a lantern, a spade, and a map from the 1829 land survey. And behind the schoolhouse, under the old stone that marked the original property line, he dug. The townspeople say they heard the scream long before they saw the smoke. When they reached the site, Halston was gone. The earth was scorched, the stone had split clean down the center, and in the hollow below, surrounded by roots like grasping fingers, lay a child's shoe, untouched by mud, perfectly preserved. Inside the heel, burned into the leather, was a name stitched backwards in fading thread, Elias. It was not just the name that stunned them, it was the way it curved, not stitched by a factory hand, but by someone careful, deliberate, someone who had sewn it to be hidden, reversed as if meant only for a mirror or for something watching from the other side. The shoe was no ordinary child's relic. It belonged to a boy, but not just any boy, one who should not have been in Whisperfield at all, not in 1829, not in 1840, not ever. The discovery shook the foundation of what little the townspeople believed they understood about Elias Stroud. Some now insisted he was not a man at all, but something older, masquerading in flesh. Others argued he was a prophet, returned to expose a sin deeper than any they'd buried in the ground. And a few, the ones who knew the Hemmings family personally, began asking a more troubling question. What if Eliza had never been missing at all? What if she had been replaced? That evening, whispers returned, but they no longer came at night. They came at noons. Leary, deaf since childhood, dropped a boiling kettle on her foot after jerking upright from her chair, claiming she'd heard a man call her by name from inside the chimney. The town's cobbler, Gregory Finch, ran from his shop screaming, ears bleeding after claiming he'd been forced to relive his brother's drowning, not as memory, but as sensation, and the gravedigger, old Thomas Bell, collapsed in the cemetery with a Bible pressed to his chest, muttering, "It wasn't the storm that killed her. It was me." I held her down. I heard the prayer coming out of her throat. The town doctor, now young Matthew Brooks, barely out of his apprenticeship, began recording the events in a bound ledger. He called them cognitive ruptures, although privately he admitted they felt like testimonies being extracted. Not offered, but taken. There were no signs of disease, no mold in the wells, no toxins in the grain, only Elias, and the feeling that memory no longer belonged to the living. Meanwhile, Elias himself did not change. He ate nothing, drank nothing, slept seemingly only during storms. His skin grew paler, but not frail, and though his boots never left prints, his presence marked every place he stood. Horses refused to step near his shadow. Children turned cold in his wake, and once, when the innkeeper's baby touched his coat, its hair turned stark white by morning. On the 20th night, someone tried to kill him. The attempt was never officially recorded, but the tavern keeper's eldest daughter later confessed in her journal, found years later beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. She had seen her father descend the stairs with a hatchet in hand, whispering to himself, "He's not a man, he's not even made of bone." She never saw him again. But the next morning, the tavern's main beam had split from floor to ceiling, a perfect line of black scorched wood as if struck by lightning from within. Elias sat at the base of the split beam, unmoved, hatchet beside him, rusted, untouched. He began carving the wood with a finger. One line, repeated over and over again, etched into the burned oak like a litany. They said it aloud. Now it must be lived. When Miriam Cross's former assistant, a timid woman named Ruth Denner, saw the carvings, she collapsed. She recognized the phrase. It had appeared once before. Not in a book, not in any sermon, but on the skin of a patient she and Miriam had treated 5 years prior, a girl found unconscious near the salt marshes. The phrase had been branded into the inside of her thigh in reversed script. That girl's name, Eliza Hemmings, or so she had claimed. But when Ruth Denner retrieved the old file from Miriam Cross's locked cabinet, unearthed in the back room of the infirmary, the details refused to align. That patient, found near the marsh in 1835, had been approximately 11 years old, same age as the missing Eliza. But the timelines clashed. The Hemmings family hadn't reported Eliza gone until 1837, 2 full years after that child was documented. Bruised, silent, with no recollection of her own name. She had called herself Mira. That much Ruth remembered clearly, because of the oddity. Not short for anything, not from any local family, just Mira. And in her file, under behavioral notes, Miriam had written a phrase no one could forget. Speaks in others' voices, dreams aloud, claims he is still underground. Ruth's hands trembled as she reread the passage, not because of what Mira had said back then, but because, weeks earlier, on the night Elias first arrived in town, Ruth had heard those exact words outside her window. Not shouted, not spoken, just known. As if someone had placed them gently into her ear, bypassing the world altogether, claims he is still underground. Was Elias the he Mira spoke of, or had he too once been buried, not dead, but dreaming? The implications grew more tangled by the hour, and Whisperfield was unraveling right alongside them. The townspeople began sleeping in shifts. Candle sales soared. The church stood empty, though no one dared lock its doors. And still Elias walked, never hurried, never hiding. His presence was no longer questioned. He was simply accepted, like a law of nature, like death. On the 21st morning, a schoolchild named Freddie Bowers was found sitting alone on the chapel roof. When asked how he got there, he said nothing, just smiled and pointed to the sky. His mother later testified that he had not spoken a word since the night before, when he awoke screaming the phrase, Don't let her sing again. She's waking the dirt. That same morning, Ruth Denner made a choice. She descended into the infirmary basement and broke the iron lock on the old root cellar door. Inside was everything Miriam had hidden. Not just notes, but objects. A ribbon burned at one end, a Bible with several pages torn out, and a bundle of hair tied with twine, labeled simply, "Eliza, do not bury." Beneath that was a sealed envelope. No address, no date, just the words, "If he comes." Inside was a letter in Miriam's hand. It read, "He was never a man, Ruth. Not like us. He's not made of memory. He's made of what we forget, what we bury, what we silence. The deeper the town hides its history, the stronger he becomes." Whisperfield isn't cursed. It is cultivated, watered with lies. He doesn't seek revenge. He seeks resonance. He doesn't punish the guilty. He reminds the forgetful. If he's walking among us again, it means we're forgetting something too dangerous to remain hidden. He doesn't speak, because the town already knows the words. Ruth fell to her knees. That night, the bells rang again. But this time, they came from beneath the chapel floor. People gathered, not out of faith, but fear, and when they reached the altar, they found the stone split anew. The same place Clara Pike had been pulled from weeks earlier. Now open again, but empty. No child, no soil, just a voice. Not spoken aloud, yet heard by every soul in Whisperfield. The name you buried is not the name you lost. Dig deeper, and standing alone at the edge of the chapel steps, Elias raised his hand for the first time since arriving and pointed to the old cemetery on the hill. The message was clear, though unspoken. The dead had more to say. Before midnight, a dozen townspeople gathered at the wrought iron gate. Some clutched lanterns, others holy books. One carried a pistol, though no one could say what use it might be against whatever Elias truly was. They moved in silence. Whisperfield's oldest cemetery had not been used in nearly 20 years. Left to thistles and vines after the new burial ground opened closer to town, but its graves were untouched, preserved beneath a stand of elder trees that never lost their leaves. The group paused at the threshold, unsure where to begin. But Elias did not waver. He walked a straight line, boots barely disturbing the weeds, until he reached a broken stone at the far northwest corner. The name on the marker had long since eroded, but beneath the moss, the dates remained visible. Born March 2nd, 1829, died unknown. It was not the missing date that disturbed them. It was the absence of a death year entirely. Just a scratch where the final number should have been, as if the stonecutter had paused and never resumed. Elias knelt, placed both hands on the soil, and closed his eyes. The bells began again, but this time they were different, not from below, from within. Each person at that gravesite heard a bell tuned precisely to their own fear. Ruth Denner heard the dinner bell from her childhood, the one that rang the day her father vanished in a flood. Sheriff Halston heard the school bell the moment he'd arrived to find young Eliza missing, and Thomas Bell, the gravedigger, heard the chime from his wedding day, the very same bell that had rung while his bride collapsed in the aisle and died before saying her vows. Each bell was a memory or a warning. When the sound ceased, Elias stood and stepped aside, and though no tool had touched the ground, the grave had opened, cleanly, precisely, as if excavated from beneath. Inside was no coffin, no body, just a single object, a wooden mask. Its surface was charred, but not from fire. The wood was warped in places where heat could not reach, twisted like driftwood, as if reshaped by pressure from deep under the earth. Across its surface, etched into the grain, were lines forming a face not human, too symmetrical, too ancient. The eye holes were wide and hollow, and behind them, not shadow but movement, like mist rolling inside a sealed jar. Ruth picked it up before anyone could stop her. The moment her fingers touched the mask, she gasped. Not from pain, but from recognition. "It's not for wearing," she whispered. "It's for remembering." Her voice had changed, not entirely, but subtly, as if it had been tuned, like a note brought into harmony with a greater chord. She turned to Elias, whose expression remained unreadable, and said only one thing: "You left it here when you died." It was the first time anyone had spoken to him with certainty about who or what he might have been. But Elias didn't nod, didn't smile. He simply reached out, took the mask back, and placed it at the base of the gravestone. The mist inside the mask vanished, and in that instant, every candle in town went out. Even those unlit. At that exact moment, Miriam Cross's ledger, long hidden in her infirmary desk, opened itself to a page no one had touched in years. A single phrase had appeared in fresh ink. We buried his voice, but not his memory. The ink was still wet when Ruth returned to the infirmary and found the ledger open on the desk. A desk locked and untouched since the week Miriam Cross died. There were no inkwells nearby, no footprints on the dust-covered floor, just that sentence, as if someone had waited years for the town to dig deep enough to deserve the truth. By dawn, the cemetery was sealed. Not by decree, but by fear. Every resident who had seen the mask now avoided the northern hill. The land felt different, not cursed, worse, aware. When birds flew overhead, they never passed directly above the broken grave, and children began waking with dreams that did not belong to them. One little boy, Henry Locke, woke weeping for his wife lost at sea, though he had only just turned 6. A girl, Lily Turner, drew pictures of stone chambers with no light and names carved into the ceiling, names that matched 3 families who had lived in Whisperfield during its founding, long since vanished from any known record. By the 23rd day of Elias's presence, silence returned to the town. Not the same hush as before, but a deeper one. A silence thick with listening. Even the wind refused to move through the chapel. Doors no longer creaked. Footsteps made no sound on the tavern floor. It was as if Whisperfield had become a stage set for a voice that required no air. That was when the letters began. Folded slips of paper found on porches, in basins, beneath pillows. Each one contained only a name. No other markings. No sender, just a name. Handwritten in elegant script, identical on every note. The first 5 were people long dead. The next 5 were not. Among them, Ruth Denner. Sheriff Halston read the names aloud at a town meeting, but none of them responded. They sat motionless, listening, waiting, until Ruth rose, slowly, and walked to the front of the room. She placed a hand over the sheriff's list, stared at Elias, standing in the back, and said quietly, "These aren't names. They're memories waiting to be heard." And then she collapsed. No cause of death was ever found. Her body bore no marks, no illness. Her heart had not stopped, yet she had ceased. Her eyes open, her mouth gently parted as if mid-sentence. They buried her 3 days later, but some say her lips continued to move beneath the shroud. After Ruth's death, Elias vanished for 3 nights. Gone. No sightings, no presence. The air lightened, birds returned. Some began to hope it was over, that his work, whatever it had been, was finished. The tavern reopened. Children returned to lessons. The chapel's bell, once fractured, was found mended, its rope replaced with fresh cord. Sheriff Halston even organized a day of prayer. But on the 4th night, the tavern boy, now older, quiet, hardened, entered town square and rang the bell without cause. He spoke just once. "Open the well." There was only one well in Whisperfield old enough to matter. Sealed since 1819 after a boy had fallen in and drowned. The event had nearly torn the town apart, as the boy was the only son of its wealthiest patron, who had mysteriously left Whisperfield the following week and was never heard from again. They broke the seal just after midnight. Inside the well, 6 feet down, was a plank of wood, and nailed to that plank, weathered by time but unmistakable, was a mask, not the one from the grave. A second one. This mask bore no carvings, no eye holes, just a mouth, sewn shut with wire, and from somewhere deeper in the earth came a sound none could place. A voice, yes, but not Elias. It was a child, and it was laughing. The laugh echoed up from the well like a memory shaken loose, as if something trapped for over 20 years had only just remembered how to make sound. Several townspeople screamed. One man dropped his lantern into the shaft, hoping to illuminate the source. The light fell for several seconds before being snuffed out without a sound. What came next was worse than laughter. Breathing, slow, deliberate, childlike. Not strained or panicked. Rhythmic, as if the child below had been waiting for someone to listen. Sheriff Halston ordered the well resealed, but the tavern boy stepped forward, his eyes glassy, his voice flat. You can't bury him twice. That's what started it. He turned to Elias, who had reappeared silently behind them, standing just at the edge of the torchlight. For the first time, Elias's coat was open. Beneath it, pinned across his chest like a sash, were scraps of paper, names, drawings, pieces of cloth, each burned at the edges. Trophies or warnings, none could say. The townsfolk didn't sleep that night. The wind returned, but not as comfort. It carried words, fragmented phrases, pieces of conversations no one remembered having. They came in dreams, in flickering lanterns, in the sound of church pews creaking despite being empty. One girl claimed her doll had whispered a question to her in the dark. Do you still believe he's the first one? The town historian, Abraham Nestler, a recluse who had not attended public gatherings in 15 years, emerged the next day with a map. It was a surveyor's drawing from 1805, back when Whisperfield had been little more than a trading post. On the map, just outside where the modern chapel now stood, was a strange marking, a circle within a square, labeled only with the Latin word memoriam. According to Nestle, early records spoke of a ritual practiced by the settlement's founders. Once every 7 years, they would gather at the site and speak aloud the names of the dead. Not all the dead, but only those at risk of being forgotten. It was believed that by remembering them aloud, their spirits would remain quiet beneath the earth. But something had interrupted the tradition. The last recorded memoriam ceremony was in 1817. The well was sealed in 1819, and Elias Stroud had been born, or at least appeared, in 1829. No one could prove a connection, but no one needed to. The pattern was too precise. Something had been buried alive. Not a person, perhaps, but an idea. A ritual. A memory the town chose to abandon, and something else had taken its place. The mask from the well was removed at dusk. It took 3 men, each with thick gloves, to lift it. Not because it was heavy, but because touching it induced nausea and confusion. One man vomited. Another claimed to forget his own name for nearly 2 minutes. The mouth of the mask remained stitched, yet one of the wires had begun to unravel, uncoiling itself like a snake. Elias never approached it. Instead, he watched from afar, and when the mask was brought into the chapel for safekeeping, he turned away and walked into the forest behind the cemetery. He did not return for 3 days. On the 3rd day, a letter appeared nailed to the tavern door. No one saw who placed it. It bore no name, no greeting. Just this. He was not the first, but he remembers the first, and the first remembers all of you. Below the message, in the same ink, was a symbol. Not a word, not a drawing, a spiral, broken at the top. The exact shape carved into the forehead of the mask. Abraham Nestle was the first to recognize it. He traced it back to a page in a 1786 journal kept by Elias Finch, one of Whisperfield's founders. In it, Finch described a meeting with an unnamed man from the great marshes to the south, who brought with him a wooden mask, a warning, and a request that the townspeople remember the names of the drowned every spring, lest the Whisperer rise. The mask, Finch wrote, was never to be worn. It was to be watched. That phrase unsettled Nestle more than any other. Not hidden, not preserved. Watched, as if the object itself required supervision, a guardian to ensure it remained dormant, and more importantly, silent. Nestle brought his findings to the remaining council members. Only 4 still attended. The rest had either fled, fallen ill, or gone silent entirely. He read the journal aloud beneath the chapel eaves. When he finished, the mask, sealed in a crate behind him, began to hum. Not loudly, not musically, just a low vibration, the kind that seems to come from within your own chest. No one moved. Elias was not present, but the town felt his absence like a warning. And then the mask spoke, not aloud, not in sound, but every person standing near it, every soul who had seen the symbol, heard the same thing in their mind. Who kept the first voice? It was a question, and it demanded an answer. The mask was placed back into the well that night, lowered carefully, resealed with iron, and left beneath a fresh capstone. But the question did not go away. Over the next 2 days, townspeople began confessing things that made no sense. A farmer admitted to knowing a lullaby from a country he'd never visited. A widow recalled a burial she could not have witnessed. Children recited names no longer found in any record, and in the infirmary, now empty, abandoned after Ruth Denner's death. A third mask was found. It was smaller, bone white. No eyes, no mouth, no carvings, just a crack running from crown to chin. Inside the mask, scratched along the interior curve, were the words, "Not all the drowned went under." When Elias finally returned, he said nothing. But he did stop walking. He remained seated on the chapel steps for 3 days straight, unmoving, unblinking. The tavern boy, now referred to simply as the witness, sat beside him. Each hour that passed, a new object appeared between them. First a ribbon, then a spoon, then a child's tooth. No one placed them. No one saw where they came from. Sheriff Halston approached on the 4th night, trembling. He stood before Elias and asked one question. "What do you remember?" Elias raised his hand slowly and pointed to Halston's chest. The sheriff staggered backward, his mouth opened, not to speak, but to scream. No sound emerged. He clutched at his shirt, tore it open, and beneath his skin, faintly visible through the muscle of his chest, was the spiral. It pulsed once, then vanished. Halston fell to his knees and began weeping like a child. The witness placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "That wasn't your memory, but you kept it anyway." It was the final confirmation the town needed. Elias had not brought these memories. He had returned for them. Whatever lived in Whisperfield's history, whatever had been silenced, buried, rewritten, was rising again. Not as ghosts, not as revenge, as recollection. And Whisperfield, it seemed, had once chosen to forget something no one should ever forget. Not because it was evil, but because it was still listening. That idea changed everything. It reframed Elias, not as a prophet or a curse, but as a conduit. A figure made not of vengeance or justice, but of retention. A keeper of things not written down, a warden of buried voices. And it explained the one detail no one had ever dared say aloud. Elias Stroud had no past, no birth record, no lineage, no scars from childhood. His eyes didn't age, though his body bore the shape of time. And most damning of all, no one remembered seeing him before 1840, but the spiral appeared long before that, Abraham Nestler found sketches of the same broken spiral etched in the back of an 1802 ledger belonging to a fur trapper named Samuel Ritten. The same spiral had appeared in a traveler's diary in 1763. A stranger met on the banks of a frozen river who spoke nothing but made every man feel his mother's voice. Even further back, in a letter dated 1691, a Puritan preacher described a mask found buried in ash near a burned village, marked with a sign that breaks where the loop should close. Each time, the same pattern. No one spoke of it afterward. The records stopped, the memory faded, and each time, something was left behind. In the days following Sheriff Halston's collapse, the town grew quieter still. Whisperfield no longer resisted Elias's presence. It accommodated it. Homes remained shuttered. People avoided mirrors. No bells rang. Even the birds ceased their morning cries. Those who remained, the ones who hadn't fled to Lincoln or Omaha, lived in suspended ritual, as if trying not to think too loudly. But the thinking happened anyway. Thoughts crept in. Names. Moments. Terrible recollections no one had reason to remember. One woman recalled helping a man bury a child, though she had never borne children. A farmer saw his own hands building a door frame in a chapel that no longer existed. The tavern boy dreamt of being nailed inside a wall and awoke with splinters under his fingernails. Then the dreams turned to songs. Each night, the same tune echoed across town, too faint to follow, too precise to ignore. It came from underground, always in the same rhythm, always ending with a child's voice humming the final note. It wasn't random. It was a signal, a melody meant for someone who hadn't yet remembered their part. On the seventh night, Abraham Nestler died. They found him in his study, eyes open, smiling, face turned toward the north wall, where the broken spiral had been scratched into the plaster in fresh ink. A single sheet of paper lay beside him. It contained only one phrase. It is not one voice, it is the memory of many wearing one name. That was the final puzzle piece. Elias was not singular. He was a vessel, a mask worn by whatever memory had grown too large to remain silent, and like a tide, it returned when enough had been forgotten, when the names buried too deeply began to rot, when truth turned to superstition and guilt calcified into myth. Sheriff Halston convened the remaining townsfolk. No more hiding, no more avoidance. The chapel bell rang again, not in fear, but defiance. They would dig. They would uncover every grave with no name, every sealed chamber beneath the old school, every cellar door long forgotten. They would say every name out loud, even the ones they didn't understand. They would remember everything. But Elias didn't join them. He remained seated beneath the elder tree in the cemetery, hands folded, eyes shut, waiting. Not for them, for the voice beneath the well, because as the people of Whisperfield began to uncover what they had lost, something else had begun to stir in the dark, and this time it did not laugh. It whispered back, not in words, not even in language. The whisper was older than vocabulary, deeper than sound. It was the feeling of a mother hearing her child's cry from beneath the floorboards. It was the ache behind a priest's eyes when he forgets a prayer he said every day for 30 years. It was the sensation of a name you almost remember, sitting on the edge of your breath, until it slips away again. Whisperfield heard it in its bones. Those who had gone digging beneath the chapel found more than burial chambers. They found rooms, sealed spaces lined with salt and symbols, with stones too smooth to be natural and doors too narrow for men. No one could explain them. There were no hinges, no handles, just thin, perfect slits carved into the bedrock, as though waiting for something thin enough, quiet enough, to slip through. Inside the largest chamber, they found a book, or what resembled one. It was not paper, not leather. Each page was like a pressed layer of skin, taut, yellowed, warm to the touch, and though it bore no title, its pages pulsed with ink that darkened when brought near firelight. The ink was not in English, but one name appeared over and over again, as if branded across every chapter: Elias. Nestled between the repetitions were diagrams, not of rituals, but anatomies. Diagrams of masks, human faces opened like books, vocal cords strung like instruments, spirals etched into the folds of a brain. Ruth Denner's handwriting appeared twice in the margins, even though she had died weeks earlier. One note read, "The voice was never his. It was only stored there." The other, "Every silence has a speaker. Some are just waiting for a mouth." That night, the spiral reappeared. Not in town. In the sky, high above the chapel where the stars had gone missing, clouds curled in impossible shapes. A spiral too perfect to be weather. It hung above the town like an eye half-lidded in judgment, and when the wind blew, it did not carry air. It carried voices, the prayers of those long dead, pleading to be remembered not in sanctity, but in full, with the blood, the sins, the endings left out of Scripture. And beneath the elder tree, Elias stood. He moved not toward the chapel, nor the town, but toward the well. The tavern boy followed him. Now no longer a boy, but something else entirely. His eyes mirrored Elias's. His breath didn't fog the air. Together, they knelt by the capstone. No tools were used, no words spoken. The seal broke with a sound like tearing cloth, and out from the well came light. Not divine, not holy, it was the color of dying leaves, of paper soaked in ash, and from that light came shape, the outline of a figure, childlike in size, but wrong in proportion. Its hands were too long, its jaw unhinged. Where its eyes should have been were only indentations, as if its face had never been allowed to look back. It wore no mask, because it was the mask. And as it rose from the well, Elias bowed, not in fear, not in worship, in acknowledgement. For the first time, he opened his mouth, and from it came a sound Whisperfield had not heard in generations. A name, not Elias, not Eliza, a name none of them recognized, yet all somehow remembered. And when he said it, the mask in the chapel cracked. The book closed itself, and every door in town unlocked. They creaked open in unison, hinges groaning like a choir of old men waking from a shared dream. Barns, cellars, closets, crypts. The town's sealed past unlatched itself, not in welcome, but in inevitability. Some doors opened onto darkness, others onto rooms that hadn't existed before. One opened to a corridor of mirrors, none of which reflected the person standing in front of them. Another revealed an attic filled with children's shoes, all the same size, all marked with the name Elias. Whisperfield was no longer just a town, it was a memory palace laid bare. The thing that had emerged from the well did not speak. It didn't need to. Its presence etched recollection into every structure it passed. The wood of door frames bent beneath it, bleeding sap that smelled of ink. Chimneys expelled smoke in reverse. And wherever it walked, the ground did not indent. It rose slightly, as if the earth itself recognized an old occupant. The people of Whisperfield did not scream. They listened, they remembered, and one by one, they fell to their knees. Not out of fear, out of recognition. They saw in that childlike shape not a monster, not a spirit, but the face of something they had chosen not to carry, every unsaid name, every hidden grief, every song left unfinished at the edge of a funeral. They saw it all walking toward them, and as Elias walked beside the figure, his body began to change. He became younger, not in flesh, but in posture, in presence. His eyes softened, his hands no longer clenched, and when he passed the tavern where Ruth Denner's body had once been laid out for viewing, a breath escaped his lips, soft and warm, as if exhaling a memory he no longer needed to carry. The tavern boy, the witness, stopped at the chapel steps. He looked at the mask still resting on the altar, now cracked clean down the center. "I know who wore it first," he said. The chapel doors closed behind him. No one followed. Inside, he knelt, picked up the broken mask, and placed it over his own face. It held. It fit. And though the crack split it in two, the boy did not tremble. His voice rang out across the town, not from his mouth, but from every wall, every window, every well. "You buried a name to protect your children, but you buried the wrong one." The wind stopped. The spiral above the town began to close. Not in silence, but in song. A single note, low and steady, resonated through the valley like the hum of a forgotten hymn. It rose not from the sky, but from the ground beneath the chapel, where the sealed chambers had long held what should have never been hidden. The book reopened. This time, its pages were blank. And on that final page, in ink that wrote itself, a new name appeared. It was not Elias. It was not Eliza. It was not even human. Just a sound, unpronounceable, but felt deeply in the marrow of everyone who read it. The kind of name you don't say aloud. You live it. You carry it. You mourn it before you understand it. The child figure from the well placed its palm against the earth. The spiral vanished. The town lights dimmed, and for a moment, all was still. Until the final door, a trap door in the floor of the infirmary, burst open with such force it split the beams above it. Inside was nothing, just dirt and the faint imprint of a hand. A child's hand. Reaching upward, frozen in time. As if waiting to be grasped, Dr. Miriam Cross had once written a phrase in the margins of her journal, long before her death, long before Whisperfield had accepted the presence of Elias Stroud. If a hand reaches from the earth, it is not always for rescue. Sometimes it pulls memory down with it. That sentence was found again, this time carved into the wall beside the trapdoor, as though her warning had lingered in the very timber. Sheriff Halston, now gaunt and silent, touched the edge of the handprint and felt the soil crumble. It wasn't dry, it was warm, and it pulsed, not like a heartbeat, but like breath. The infirmary filled with people, drawn there not by alarm, but compulsion, as if Whisperfield itself was guiding them. Elias did not join them. He stood just beyond the porch, watching, waiting. One woman reached into the soil. Her fingers trembled but sank without resistance. She screamed, not from pain, but recognition. "My mother's lullaby," she gasped, yanking her hand back. "It sang it to me from below." Another man, hesitant but desperate, tried next. He heard a confession, his own, one he had never spoken aloud, one he had only thought years ago as he watched a barn burn with someone inside. Each villager who touched the earth emerged altered, not haunted, not hurt, hollowed, as if something they had hidden was no longer theirs to carry. The tavern boy emerged from the chapel, the broken mask still on his face, but now it had changed. The crack had fused. The surface had smoothed. It no longer looked worn. It looked deliberate, complete. He stood beside the trapdoor and whispered, "This is not the end. This is the moment before the beginning was made wrong." The childlike figure from the well appeared beside him, silent as ever. It placed its hand over the print in the dirt, and the floor shuddered. Not just of the infirmary, but the entire town. Somewhere deep beneath Whisperfield, something vast began to stir. Not evil, not divine, just aware. The kind of awareness that does not judge, does not punish, but remembers everything. The walls of the infirmary peeled back, one slat at a time, revealing not insulation or beams, but names. Thousands of them, etched into the interior like tally marks of the forgotten. Names that didn't appear in any census, names no priest had read at a funeral, names no child had been taught in school. Elias stepped forward. He removed his coat. Beneath it was not skin. It was parchment, his entire body covered in script, not ink, but scar, every name ever unspoken carved into his flesh. And now, with the chapel bell tolling in perfect rhythm, those names began to lift from him like ash in a breeze. He was being erased. No, released, because Elias had never lived. He had been compiled. Each time a name was silenced, each time a child was buried without song, each time a door was shut on an unspeakable thing, Elias was built, layer by layer, silence by silence. Until one day, Whisperfield had enough secrets to summon him, and now he was returning them. The people of Whisperfield wept, not from fear, from memory. And in the center of the town square, where the first well had once stood, a new figure began to rise. Not Elias, not the child, but a third, smaller, fragile, with a ribbon in her hair. She opened her mouth, but she did not speak. She sang. The sound was small, thread-thin, but it carried. It moved like smoke through the streets, curling into windows, slipping beneath door frames, passing through keyholes and the gaps in floorboards. The song was not in any known language, but everyone understood it. Not the words, there were none, but the feeling. It was the melody of being remembered, not fondly, not bitterly, just truthfully. And that was the most unbearable part. The people of Whisperfield fell to their knees, not in prayer, but in collapse. Their bodies remembered things their minds had discarded. The slap of water, the chill of unfinished lullabies, the guilt of stepping around doors that should have been opened. Some tried to block their ears, but the song was not sound. It was inside them already. The girl kept singing, and with every note, Elias faded further. The writing on his body turned pale, then transparent, until his skin became a veil of smoke, then nothing at all. His mouth never opened again. He did not speak, because he never had. He had been the shell, the mask, the archive. The childlike figure from the well stepped beside the girl and took her hand. Together, they stood where the original spiral had been carved in the earth, and from the soil a light emerged, not blinding, not divine. Just honest. It showed the town as it had once been, before the forgetting, before the silence, small homes, faces unblurred by time, laughter unburdened by dread, children calling out to one another by name, names that had been buried, renamed, or rewritten in the decades since. In the vision, one could see the chapel before it bore the bell tower. It had no altar, no pews, just a single circle of stones and a promise carved into the lintel above the door. To keep memory safe, so none must wear it. That promise had been broken, and so Elias had been worn. The girl, she of the ribbon, of the song, turned toward the townspeople who now sat quietly in the square, their faces streaked with tears. She raised one hand, not in warning, in offering. A choice. The childlike figure placed a second mask on the ground, unmarked, untouched, empty. It did not move, did not hum, did not whisper, but every person in that square understood its meaning. They had one chance, one final moment to decide whether memory would once again be buried or carried, whether the sins of forgetting would be layered again upon new names, new faces, new children, or whether this time someone would wear the truth willingly. Sheriff Halston stood. His face had aged 10 years in a night. His hands trembled, but he walked toward the mask and knelt beside it. He did not touch it. He simply whispered, "I knew what we did. I just didn't want to know it out loud." The mask did not respond, but it glowed, faintly, briefly, then dimmed. The spiral returned to the sky, not broken, but whole. And slowly, like dust settling after a storm, the memory began to disperse. Not to vanish, but to distribute. Each person felt it lodge somewhere behind their eyes, in the curve of their ribs, in the softness of their palms. 1,000 memories, shared, carried, no longer hidden in one man, one mask, one silence. The girl's song ended. She looked toward the elder tree, now blooming out of season, and spoke one word, the only one she would ever say. Enough. And then she vanished. Not disappeared, released, and the childlike figure followed, leaving behind only the mask and a town finally remembering itself. In the weeks that followed, Whisperfield changed, not quickly, not loudly, but thoroughly. Doors once sealed by superstition remained open. Graves were tended, even the ones with no names, especially those. The bell tower was taken down. In its place, they planted a circle of elder trees, one for each lost child, each hidden sin, each silence that had once demanded a voice. And in the center of that circle, they placed the mask, not as warning, as witness. Visitors came. Some said they heard humming near the well. Others claimed their dreams were visited by a girl with a ribbon in her hair, asking softly, "What did they forget about you?" Most left changed. A historian from Chicago arrived to catalog the town's archives and wept upon reading the margins of Miriam Cross's final journal. Not for the loss, but for the truth finally spoken aloud. A young woman from St. Louis, searching for a grandmother no one admitted existed, found her name carved into the infirmary's foundation beside the symbol of the spiral. The spiral was everywhere now, drawn in chalk by children on fence posts, baked into bread crusts, hung in windows, but never closed. Always open at the top, a reminder that memory is not a loop, but a path meant to be walked again and again. As for Elias Stroud, no grave was ever found. No bones, no monument. He required none, because the people who had once forced their memories onto him now held them for themselves. And in doing so, had finally allowed Elias to rest, or whatever version of rest a memory like his could find. The tavern boy, once the witness, now a man with no mask, remained in Whisperfield. He became its quiet steward. Never a mayor, never a priest, just someone who ensured the spiral stayed open, that no child was buried without a name, that no door was locked without explanation, and every 7 years, the townsfolk gathered in the clearing. They did not sing hymns, they did not chant, they spoke names, some old, some new, some still unborn, and they ended each gathering with the same promise, etched now in every beam of the rebuilt chapel. We remember to lighten the ones who carried us. Not all understood it, but they felt it, and they passed it on. The well once feared became a wishing place. Coins were never thrown in. Only words, whispers of regret, apology, hope. Not to summon anything, not to conjure, just to mark that someone had spoken what had once been forbidden. Some say the town is still haunted, not by ghosts, by memory. It lingers in the trees, in the quiet, in the way no one forgets your name even if you've only just arrived. Some say Whisperfield knows who you are before you say it, because someone, once, long ago, learned the cost of forgetting and paid it in silence. But not anymore. Because now, when a child is born in Whisperfield, the first thing they hear, before the cry, before the breath, is their name, spoken aloud by every elder in the room. And when they die, years or decades later, their name is spoken again, not with grief, with recognition, with gratitude, with memory. And somewhere far beneath the elder trees, in the warm earth that once held too much, a faint imprint remains, not of pain, but of a hand. Open, upturned, empty at last.